Oh, it's fine, you can go ahead. Especially as things are heating up in Europe and the war is going on, we get involved a little bit late, but here's what Wilson says when we get involved. This is a war to end all wars. This is a war to spread democracy. And that becomes just a bridge too far for a lot of women's suffrage supporters. And Alice Paul, again, she's so good at using his words against him. We're not. Let's not even pretend. Half the population can't vote. That's not a democracy. If we're here to give voices to all the subjugated people throughout the world, look in your own backyard first. So then they come up with, she and her supporters come up with a protest. And they're trying to change minds throughout the nation. You can read through some of these quotations from people who did not support women's suffrage. They've got to do something. And she's trained in England, deeds, not words. Our words aren't convincing them at this point. So they set up a silent protest. They're called Silent Sentinels. Every day, Monday through Saturday, dawn till dusk, outside of the White House, holding up their signs. They started on January 10th, 1917. It runs for almost 2.5 years until June of 1919. That's when the House and Senate passed through women's suffrage. And they constantly pointed out, especially once the United States joins the war, the hypocrisy. How are we fighting for democracy abroad when we're denying it to, right off the bat, half the people back home? By the end of this, over 2,000 women would participate. At first, the president tolerated it. It annoyed him, but he just had to deal with it. It starts in January of 17. In April of 17, that's when we declare war. And that's when things started to change. People who were walking by started to get angry at the women. They said that it was unpatriotic, what they were doing, protesting the president during wartime. They said that it was a disgrace to the nation for this. Wilson gets embarrassed. He doesn't want this to be happening. So they worked to find a way to remove these women. And the charge that they came up with, who's seen Iron Jawed Angels? Am I preaching to the choir here? Okay, then you don't get an answer if you've seen the movie. Does anyone, you've seen the movie? Calm down.
I've seen it.
What was the arrest charge? As you look at this picture, it should be glaringly obvious.
Desecrating the flag.
No. Obstructing traffic.
Oh.
See them? See them there obstructing traffic? Out of the way! That was the charge. Everyone knows that it's a bullshit charge. Everyone's very aware of what's going on with this, but they get arrested. And they're sent to a workhouse for this. Over the next 5 months, while these arrests are happening, over 168 women are arrested. But the deal is, every time they're arrested, the next day, more women take their place. They get 60-day sentences, so then some women would be released. They'd go straight back out and do it again. 168 women. I'm going to put up a political cartoon from the time, and that man back there is saying, why are they bothering us with this when we're trying to make the world safe for democracy? Again, pointing out that they thought this protest was unpatriotic, that this was not the correct way to be protesting something like this. So I would just argue, what they were doing was a silent, peaceful protest, standing outside there, putting up Wilson's words, which might have been embarrassing. In our history, we have had less than peaceful protests. We've had some that are very disruptive. Boston Tea Party, economically disruptive, wasting a lot of things. Tarring and feathering does not strike me as being a peaceful way to protest against tax collectors. We celebrate them in our history. In the 1960s and 1970s, we get peaceful protests with the African American civil rights movements and with other civil rights movements too. People locking arms to march for civil rights or taking a knee to support civil rights. Closer to home, more recently, in Idaho, we've had silent protests down in our capital to add the 4 words. Silent protests, peaceful protests, sometimes met with some anger and some violence as well. And I think we can all see exactly where I'm going. Subtlety is never my strong suit. Where we see silent, peaceful protests happening just this last week, where people are arguing that it's unpatriotic. I would argue in our nation's history, we have a tendency to remember things differently, though. If we look at how people have protested, we tend to remember things a lot better than often they happened. I can guarantee that in a little bit we'll look at this last weekend much differently than what's going on now. Alice Paul didn't participate at first. I'm going to have you go back if you hit the left button. She didn't participate at first, but when the arrest kept going, she joined in. She was arrested. This was seen as a big coup. Get her out of the way. Get her in prison. She wasn't allowed to see a lawyer. She initiated a hunger strike, though. She got the other women to join in with her. And then they started panicking. Oh my God, she's going to die. And if she dies, it's just going to bring more attention. Let's force feed her. And they force fed her very violently. She didn't die until 1977. She suffered health effects for the rest of her life as they strapped her down and shoved the tube down her throat. This is the point where Wilson steps back in and says, this is not actually going to work for us. And the women were released. This is in November. A few months later, Wilson says, we should give, and he always uses that word, we should give women the right to vote. He called it a wartime measure. It's a way to thank them for all of their efforts in the war. He would never give Alice Paul credit because he hated her so much. That's in 1918. He says that it takes a little bit longer for Senate and the House of Representatives to get that through. And then if you know your schoolhouse rock, you know that then it has to go to states to get enough states to ratify it. The ratification for the women's suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment, is as dramatic as you can get. Got down to the last state. We needed one more state to do it. The women's suffrage supporters knew how the state legislators were going to vote. Gets down to Tennessee. They've got it counted. They think we're golden. But supporters wore a white rose and opponents wore a red rose. And as they came marching into the State House that day to vote, they started looking and they started recounting the roses, and someone overnight had swapped. Someone who's supposed to be wearing a white rose had swapped to a red, meaning he was going to vote against women's suffrage. And they start to panic. This is it. This is what they've been working for. And if it's not going to happen now, when's it ever going to happen? And they're doing the roll call. Are you in favor? Aye. And they get to the youngest guy there, Harry Burns. He's 24 years old. And Hollywood couldn't have made this up better. A telegram is sent in from his mom, because that's what we do, that pretty much says, you better vote for this. And he's wearing his red rose. He gets the telegram. He stands up, rips off his rose, and he votes in favor of women's suffrage. And it's just enough. That was on August 18th, 1920. It took a little more than a week for the Secretary of State to actually put it in. So now we celebrate the passage of the 19th Amendment on August 26, 1920. Here is Alice Paul outside the NWP headquarters in DC celebrating with women there. This is something it took 150 years to get, and through a lot of protests, some peaceful, some a little bit more dramatic. So a few weeks ago down in Lewiston, we had our National Women's Equality Day march and rally. And this is why we do that. So I thought she was clapping for herself because she's up there. She would totally clap for herself. We celebrate. It's a big deal in our house. We celebrate National Women's Equality Day. We also have Elvis shrines, so I don't know how normal we are. But this is why we do it. Our next generation is going to come up. And things that we take for granted now, these very basic rights, we still see them being denied to people in different ways. And as we trace the history of women's suffrage, I think that is the history of the United States. We can see all the different threads of U.S. history playing out in the fight for women's suffrage. Here are our ideals, here are our goals. We don't always land there. We've denied them to different people. But it takes these kinds of protests to get it to happen. So I think I'm going to end there. Were we doing a question? Dulcie's here now. Are we doing a question and answer portion? Okay. Did she just say no? Oh.
She's having a home.
Ignore that, Charles. All right, so I will take questions, so thank you for coming.